politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
Good afternoon from downtown Washington to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. Welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Anne Hodern alongside Joe Matthew, and we're in for David Weston. Joe, it's a really somber Monday morning here. We had yesterday those 13 fallen troops arrive, the president meeting them. And now tomorrow is this withdrawal. We don't have an exact date, but the Pentagon saying this morning it doesn't see a role in evacuations after August 31st.
Yeah.
What comes next?
And we're going to hear very little from the Pentagon, I suspect, over the next 24 hours, Anne-Marie. It's great to be with you despite the news that we're talking about today. That's a day that Joe Biden will never forget. It was pre-dawn as they left to go to Dover Air Force Base for the transfer of remains, the dignified transfer, and was something that the president was already emotional about at the end of last week when you saw him in the East Room at the White House. What must be on his mind with now less than 24 hours to go?
And what they're saying is that these imminent threats, and we've heard a lot of different reports about that drone strike on a car, Pentagon yet to report whether or not civilians were a part of that. It's going to be really tough 24 hours.
One good thing that has happened is we were able to knock down, apparently with our anti-missile technology, a couple of rocket attacks against the airport in Kabul. But let's remember, night has now fallen. This is our last night there. And a lot of things could happen. As we've heard from the White House, this is now the most dangerous part.
It's 8:30 p.m. in Kabul. It's a good point. You kind of lose
Absolutely.
track of that when you're on the East Coast.
We're joined here at the start of Balance of Power by Michael Boskin. As President Biden's withdrawal continues here with the former Council of Economic Advisors chairman and now with Stanford University, where he's a professor. Chairman Michael Boskin, welcome to Balance of Power. I wonder what your thoughts are now as you write about the cruel summer that Joe Biden is experiencing. You suggest that the honeymoon ended with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I have to admit, Michael, a lot of folks thought the honeymoon was over weeks before that.
Well, first of all, good to be with you, Anne-Marie and Joe. I think that there are two things that happened here. The direct effect of the withdrawal, the chaos, the apparent inadequate planning and attention to detail that wound up making it quite chaotic. Obviously, they got a lot of people out, thankfully, with a very strong airlift capability from the military. But this has ramifications. I think every president's been in this situation where something that raises doubts about their abilities, about their competence, about their judgment, or about their team and its judgment and its ability to execute something wisely, it tends to have repercussions. It tends to have repercussions when you see poll numbers go down. Wavering congressmen and women are less likely to do something when a president tries to twist their arm, things of that sort. But I think there are two issues that are in the short run, once this is over and we have whatever we can do to help those remaining, both our own people, our allies, and Afghanis who fall alongside us. The first incentive is that the Democrats in Congress realize that Biden's been wounded by this. How much it is permanently will take weeks to understand, but certainly they hit very hard in the short term. And they will try, I believe, to rush their large agenda through Congress, trying to get a, quote, win for the team, for Biden, and for their policies. But there will also be an increased ability of moderates to say, hold on, let's just not go whole hog. Let's be more thoughtful about this. And that's the battle that we'll continue to wage inside the Democratic Party. I think it has heightened Republican resolve to only selectively work with Mr. Biden on things that they think are good for the country. The infrastructure bill, quite imperfect, but that was an example of bipartisanship. I think it will be much harder now. Presidents, when they need to have the country behind them to make difficult decisions, and this will make it harder for that to happen.
Michael, you've been talking about the comparison that Leon Panetta made to the Bay of Pigs. You say that's not what this is. This is more like, with regard to the withdrawal, what we saw for former President Jimmy Carter with the hostage crisis in Iran. How do you mean that? Because if that's the case for Joe Biden, obviously this will be something difficult to shake and could lead to a spiral in his approval ratings, make it difficult to get anything done on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think that that the Tehran problem and example in history is a bit more relevant because the idea was we had a mission and we didn't do it. Carter's was a dismal failure. It haunted him for the rest of his presidency and contributed to him losing. I think he would have lost anyway to Ronald Reagan. But the Bay of Pigs, I think, was something that was smaller. A lot of the country didn't pay a lot of attention to it, but the television coverage of this has been widespread. I think the vast majority of people are aware of what's going on, at least in a general manner. And even though foreign policy tends not to be an issue on people's minds when they vote, it's much more the economy and some other things. If it does contribute to the notion that the gang in charge can't shoot straight or has problems, that's a serious problem. So that's why I put it in the Jimmy Carter category. Now, Kennedy recovered by the masterful handling of a much more serious Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviets had missiles in Cuba. And we got to the withdrawal. We agreed, it wasn't publicly announced, we agreed also to withdraw missiles from Turkey for them to save face by agreeing to withdraw their missiles. But that, I think, put to bed the idea that Kennedy was weak or indecisive or could pull something off. Also, Kennedy had run for many, many years as a kind of pro-defense, quasi-hawkish by his party standards. Of course, had been a PT boat commander in World War II. Biden has a long history of being extremely cautious about foreign policy. When I was in the White House, he even refused to vote to authorize the first Gulf War, which, by the way, was the one decisive victory America's had since World War II.
Michael, does that not help the president, though, in the sense that most Americans agree that they want to get out of Afghanistan? And then if you look at the polls, the kitchen sink is what they're concerned about: COVID, economy. Do you think this will still linger into November of 2022?
I think there are two things that matter there, Emery. First of all, if there's a follow-up, that's a problem. If some of these terrorists that were let out of jails as part of all this, either in the beginning or when we abandoned Bagram Air Base, that would be a very, very difficult thing for Mr. Biden to shake. The second thing is what starts to happen on the foreign policy front as our adversaries, people who don't wish us well, wish us ill, see if they can take advantage that perhaps Mr. Biden will be very hesitant to use force or issue anything other than words condemning it and saying them they're going to be pariahs in the international community, which for many of these governments and leaders is no change in their status. So I think that's really what's at stake. And if there's a bumbling on other counts, these things tend to accumulate. So Mr. Biden he needs to show resolve. He needs to show also that he can understand that he made a mistake at times and he's moving to correct it. That's one of the most important things if you're trying to build confidence in people. They have a sense that your judgment allows you to grow and overcome mistakes and do better the next time. So I think that's all up in the air right now, and it really wasn't 3 months ago or 6 months ago.
Michael, thank you. Michael Boskin of Stanford University's Hoover Institution with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, the latest on military preparations ahead of tomorrow's withdrawal deadline from Afghanistan. We'll talk with a veteran now running for the Senate. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside Anne-Marie Hordern. This has been quite a day in Afghanistan already, and it's not over, Anne-Marie, but we are within 24 hours now of the deadline to withdraw, and the Pentagon is telling us that they are going to start clamping down on information as of now.
Yeah, and the question I really have is what comes next? You hear from the France, you hear from all the allies, NATO, about trying to set up a secure situation, an operation situation at the airport to make sure following August 31st, those Afghans that couldn't get out, that they have a way forward. But how do you do this with the Taliban in control? This is going to be the agenda for the next few weeks.
As they've maintained that evacuations can continue even after the U.S. military leaves, and a lot of talk about over-the-horizon missions, a new strategy that we'll be following, not so new, depending on where we're looking in the world, but that's going to be the new order for Afghanistan.
Yeah, certainly is. And joining us now to discuss more of this is Lucas Kunce. He's a retired Marine Corps major who served in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Lucas is now running for the Senate as a Democrat from Missouri. Lucas, thank you so much for giving us some of your time today. As Joe mentioned, we're just hours away now from midnight in Kabul. We're waiting for the U.S. to give us the go sign that all U.S. troops are out of Afghanistan. Many lawmakers, as you know, have pushed for the extension of that August 31st deadline to make sure they can get more people out, but you were against it. Tell us why.
Yeah, here's the thing. Like, what we're seeing with those people is it's the same people who want us there to want us to stay there are the exact same people who kept us there for 20 years. There are a lot of people who staked their reputations on Afghanistan, who got huge political donations from people who were making a lot of money in Afghanistan and everything else. And so, like, when I hear these people say just one more month, just one more day, just one more dollar, what they are actually saying, and this is what the American people saw last week, what they're actually saying is one more Marine, just one more Marine. And at this point, I'm sorry, but you had your 20 years, you had your 2,500 U.S. service members, and you had your $2.3 trillion to build something up. And instead, what you built up collapsed in just 2 weeks. And I can tell you what, anyone who was on the ground there in Afghanistan, like myself, can tell you, we saw that the Taliban taking over was inevitable. And the only people that have been pushing a different narrative are these same people who are pushing it now, who are trying to convince the American people that all that time, all that money, and all those lives were worthwhile. And we cannot let them win that narrative. We have to fight back against that narrative, because we have seen that it's not successful.
I want to ask you a question about women and girls. I know a lot of these groups, I know personally, are trying to get out of the country. They've been lined up for days and hours on end. The U.S. presence there are some women who are born under the U.S. presence where they don't even understand what a Taliban rule looks like. Having been on the ground, how do you expect this playing out, the plight of women and girls?
My heart absolutely breaks for them. I have been there. When I was at Marine Special Operations Command, I learned Pashto. I went to Afghanistan twice. I spoke with Taliban, with locals, with Afghan National Security Forces, and it's an absolute tragedy that after 20 years, that place was able to fall in just 2 weeks. But if you were there on the ground, you saw it coming. And I think, one of the real tragedies here is that those women and girls were victims of the same dishonesty, the same systematic institutional dishonesty that the American people were, in that we were told, elites in Afghanistan and elites in our country told us that things were going well, that this was going to work out, when it absolutely never was going to. I saw that in 2014 after my last deployment. Like, we'd been there for 13 years. And the Afghan National Security Forces still couldn't do anything without us helping them. I did all of their logistics for them. And so for me, what we need to realize is that warfare is not the answer. 240,000 Afghan civilians were killed while we were in Afghanistan, many of them women and children. We need to use the other tools at our disposal, diplomacy, statecraft, our control over money, to try to shape that country as best we can, try to get people out. But the answer is not the military. We saw last night what that looks like, or last week what that looks like. That is what war looks like. It's hundreds of civilians dying, it's many U.S. service members dying, and it is not the solution.
Lucas, I know you learned to speak Pashto on multiple special ops deployments in Afghanistan. We've learned there are still tens of thousands of our Afghan allies who will be in the country when the military leaves, interpreters, drivers, contractors. I'm assuming some of them you worked with when you were actually in the field doing combat operations. I wonder if you've spoken to any of the Afghan allies you served with since this has all happened, and what's going to happen to the rest if they can't get out?
So I did work with them. I was a foreign affairs officer on the Special Operations Task Forces, not a Special Operations operator. And so what I did, that meant my job, in addition to being a judge advocate, was to work with the Afghans. And so, like I said before, I've talked to many of them. I've worked with them very closely, and I'm doing what I can to try to help people. The woman who taught me Pashto, her family's still over there. I've been working to try to help get them out. And the reality is that some people are going to be left behind, but that does not mean that we need to continue a military operation. We need to use all of the other tools in our toolbox. We have a lot of leverage in Afghanistan right now. We have a lot of leverage after we leave. We are a powerful country with a lot of leverage in the international sphere, and we need to use that to come to the best result for everyone involved. And so that's what we need to do.
Thanks to retired Marine Corps Major Lucas Kunce, now a Senate candidate, for talking with us today. Now for Bloomberg First Word News, we bring in Mark Crumpton. Mark?
Joe, thanks. Americans may have to put off planned European vacations. European Union countries have voted to reimpose restrictions on non-essential travel from the U.S. amid a surge in new coronavirus cases. The curbs had been lifted in June. EU officials say the United States had 588 new COVID-19 cases per 100,000 residents in the past 2 weeks. That's well above the limit of 75 set out in EU guidelines. In New Orleans, residents are being warned that the safest place to be is indoors. Fires are burning out of control and more than 1 million people are without power a day after Hurricane Ida struck. The storm packs some of the most powerful winds ever to hit the area. It's now unleashing a catastrophic amount of rain as it moves slowly north. There's a new potential bump in the road for Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's re-election campaign. The country reported its sharpest one-week decline in confidence since the depth of the pandemic last year. The weakening sentiment among households could undermine what has been a big advantage for Trudeau heading into the September election. The U.S. is still evacuating people out of Afghanistan despite a rocket attack aimed at Kabul's international airport today. As a Tuesday deadline looms for the last U.S. troops to leave or hand over control of the airport to the Taliban. The United Nations plans to take up a resolution proposed by UK and France aimed at allowing exits to continue. The U.S. has evacuated 1,200 people from Kabul over the past 24 hours. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Good afternoon. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern alongside Joe Matthew. Joe, just this afternoon, we got some news about what is happening in terms of COVID restrictions. So the European Union has been open all summer. You've seen everyone's Twitter, Facebooks, Instagrams, and now reimposing travel curbs. But there's still a lot of questions on what that means.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, it's kind of like covering reconciliation. They make a big shell, and then you have to fill in the blanks. And I guess that member states, well, the countries across Europe will have to let us know how they're going to get involved here. But look, I even know some people who have trips planned imminently.
Yes.
And a lot of them are wondering what this means. I think you know some of them, too.
Well, Germany already has the U.S. classified as high-risk area. Mm-hmm. You need to show vaccination. You need to show proof that proof of vaccination, test before, test after. A lot of other countries have the test as well. But I guess this would deter a lot of travelers if they actually start putting in quarantines on people. Pretty
broad losses for airlines today, down 3% roughly for the couple big ones we're looking at, Delta, United, American. So much uncertainty for carriers now, not just internationally, but domestically as well, with people canceling plans just out of their own foresight. In many cases, people are uncomfortable to take vacations they planned just a couple of months ago.
And remember, if you're European or British, you cannot come to the United States.
Right.
So I wonder if this is the Europes, they cashed in on the summer, but now politically they're in a very difficult situation because the U.S. has yet to reciprocate. I remember the president, when he was standing with Angela Merkel earlier this summer, he said in a few weeks,
That's
maybe
right.
next week, few days, he punted it.
Now magically around Labor Day, we're having this conversation.
Yes, and we have yet to hear about when those restrictions will lift. It's going to get hard for America because the Delta variant, and we're still dealing with a number of people unvaccinated.
Absolutely.
All right, well, it is time, though, for the stock of the hour with Dave Wilson, and we're looking at Astrospace. Tried to send another rocket into orbit this weekend, but it failed. Shares are now falling steeply on the concerns that the commercial satellite business may be too difficult. What's the story here? I know they have a few other launches coming up. Is this a potentially buy the dip moment?
Well, I mean, that becomes a question, Anne-Marie. You're talking about a company that's only been public for 2 months. They combined with one of these blank check businesses, called a SPAC, if you like, at the end of June. And the shares had done reasonably well, but certainly the setback with their launch over the weekend not going over well. And, one of the 5 main engines failing at the start of the flight. It only got up to 50 kilometers as opposed to, think about 50 miles is more like it if you want to go into orbit. And that's what the company wanted to do. So, you put it all together, and it's a bit of a challenge here for this company, which, just 3 weeks ago, they signed a deal with the U.S. Space Force, and they were actually taking up a test payload for the Space Force in this flight, which didn't go according to plan, to be kind. You look at satellites, certainly they're aiming at 1 rocket a day by 2025, and most of that would go for satellites. Big business, 3,000 plus now up in the air, another 3,000 plus that are inactive. The details of this aborted flight, it shows you they've got work to do. Now, they have time to do it, arguably, because they combined with this company, Holistic, which is actually backed by telecom executive Craig McCall, as well as Bill Gates. So you're talking about more money that they can use to kind of set themselves up over the next few years, and a whole lot more market value, which basically tells you there's a lot at stake here with each of these flights, and the failure definitely having an effect on Astrospace's shares.
Dave, we all remember when Virgin Galactic went public through a SPAC. Richard Branson said, now it's your chance to own a piece of a space company. It had kind of a novelty to it. There are so many now. Where are investors supposed to begin in picking the ones that might succeed?
Well, there is still a novelty element. Bear in mind that Astrospace is a bit different than Virgin Galactic because you're talking about more commercial and government flights as opposed to, anything involved with space tourism. So, Astrospace arguably more of a competitor for Elon Musk's SpaceX, which isn't public yet, or to some extent for Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin.
Americans might be barred from Europe, but Dave, sounds like potentially they can go to space. Coming at the program, President Biden's economic agenda is shaping up to be the most expensive legislation in over a decade. A conversation with deficit hawk Maya MacGuineas next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Anne-Marie Hordern in Washington. House panels will begin reconciliation markups, here we are, of that $3.5 trillion budget framework this week, creating legislation that could push the deficit as much as $25.6 billion higher over a decade's time. And joining us now to talk about it, noted deficit hawk Maya MacGuineas, president of the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Maya, it's great to have you. Looking at the note that you were just writing about this, you're looking down the road, assuming that infrastructure, the bipartisan plan, has passed, reconciliation has passed, and you say that will be the largest deficit that we've had since the end of World War II, and that is saying something. Of course, we managed to get out of that with rapid economic growth at the time, and I wonder if you see infrastructure itself creating enough growth to help offset that deficit spending.
I think that spending on infrastructure is incredibly important because we haven't in too long, and our budget focuses much more on consumption when we should be looking at investment. So more on infrastructure is the right kind of priority. That said, whenever these promises about things paying for themselves start to come up, people should be very suspicious, and it's just not even close to true. So the returns on infrastructure are important, significant, but nowhere close to being able to offset the costs. And what the Congressional Budget Office has shown us is that if you debt finance infrastructure instead of paying for it, those returns are significantly lower. So the same story is made on tax cuts as it is on everybody's favorite programs. It's going to pay for itself. It's not. And the debt that we already have encountered and on the books is tremendous. And as you said, our debt is the highest it's ever been relative to the economy, other than right after World War II. And we are slated to borrow another $12 trillion over the next decade before you even talk about these new packages. So you just can't pretend that borrowing's not going to do real damage both to our economy and our national security. It will. And instead, we should look at these priorities and think about how do we pay for them?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of people are asking as we are about to enter September, where the showdown's going to be. Maya, I want to know what your thought was about the Moody's Mark Zandi report about how all of this was going to boost productivity and they shouldn't worry too much about inflation, et cetera, because that was a huge talking point among the Democrats. Do you agree that at least on the productivity side, there is enough benefits that could potentially help offset some of the costs?
I do think that that report is far more optimistic than anything close to what we'd see. And I look at what the Congressional Budget Office has put out. And again, that shows that if you debt finance, the returns could even be negative over time, and that it's really important that you offset the cost. That helps bring up small but worthwhile returns, but nothing close to paying for itself. It means that these priorities, when you invest instead of consume, it's going to do more for productivity growth. It's going to help grow the economy. But remember, you have to grow the economy for about $5 to get something back in taxes that is going to start to have any debt. Sorry, that was a terrible, terrible explanation, but you're not able to grow the economy nearly enough so that the revenues you get back are anywhere close for offsetting those costs. So we always have these stories. It's the same as supply side economics on tax cuts. The returns are usually about a fifth of paying for itself when it comes to tax cuts, less so for infrastructure.
Maya, I want to know, what's your assessment for the reconciliation package? Because many in Washington say, although $3.5 trillion, that top line figure, no one thinks they're really going to get to that.
Well, let me first start by saying that 3.5 number is much smaller than these policies that they're contemplating are actually likely to be. Because part of the reconciliation instructions say just end the spending if the price tag starts to be too big. And by our own calculations, it looks like they're trying to squeeze $5.5 trillion worth of spending into a price tag claiming to be $3.5 trillion. So it's already much larger. I do think that we're going to see a scaling back of the size of the package. I don't think there's an appetite to spend that much. It'd be putting us into very high levels of spending relative to the economy compared to our entire history. But that said, what I'm worried about is that people under the guise of fiscal responsibility are going to say, let's scale back on the pay-fors. And the real way you make something fiscally responsible is you figure out what's worth spending money on, what the best ways to do it, and then you figure out how to pay for it. But the hard choices are in the how to pay for part. And once we start talking about the details of the tax increases, I'm quite sure those are the things a lot of politicians are going to be more nervous about. What they need to do is set this standard out. We will only spend as much money as we are willing to pay for, either in revenue increases or other spending cuts. That's what the White House said they wanted, something that's fully paid for. That's what Congress has said, the leadership has said. They should agree that they are going to stick to that promise of only spending as much as they're willing to pay for.
Maya, we're coming off Jackson Hole last week, virtually, of course, and headed for an important jobs report on Friday. I wonder what your thoughts are on this so-called jobless recovery. Some of the data has actually been stronger lately, but with the impact of the Delta variant and kids going back to school in September, it's starting to get to be a little bit confusing here. Are you worried about job growth right now, and would inflation actually make that more of a challenge?
Yeah, it is very confusing. As I sent my kids finally back to school today, I was thrilled, but also nervous.
Congrats.
And I think that there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy, and we know that that's what we're dealing with. And so we shouldn't believe we have certainty on either side. On one hand, we don't want to borrow a lot more money right now, like we did during the COVID emergency, because that could lead to higher inflation and actually some harm by overheating the economy. On the other hand, we need to remain nimble and ready to respond if the Delta variant ends up hurting the economy more than we're anticipating. Fingers crossed it doesn't. And then we need to be able to respond quickly. You don't want to put stimulus or extra borrowing in the economy when you're seeing inflation as the big risk, but you want to be ready to pivot and make changes if things get worse. And so that is certainly one of the topics that was covered at Jackson Hole, which is how you think through the risks that exist on both sides. And we know that policymakers, both monetary and fiscal right now, are working in a really tricky time of uncertainty, but we have time to figure this out. don't anticipate as though you know whether the economy is going to turn down or not, which could risk overheating. In terms of jobs, one of the most important things is to get people back to work in a safe environment. That is going to help the economy in the long run. We were doing very well right before the COVID emergency, and it looks like we could easily return to a really positive time of employment, of growing employment and strong employment and growing wages. But everything's kind of like a tightrope right now.
Yeah, 2 step forwards, 1 step back, as I feel like this entire pandemic. Maya, thank you so much for joining us. Maya MacGuineas, president of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Coming up in the program, for more Bloomberg First Word news, we go to Mark Crumpton. Hi, Mark.
Anne-Marie, thank you. The Pentagon reportedly knew of an imminent threat at the Kabul airport hours before that suicide bombing took place. According to Politico, military officials were told to prepare for a, quote, mass casualty attack. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was quoted as saying he didn't believe people were getting the incredible amount of risk on the ground. The attack killed almost 300 people, including 13 U.S. service members. Now to the latest on Hurricane Ida. We've just learned that President Biden will meet virtually next hour with the head of FEMA and the governors of Louisiana and other affected states. Meanwhile, Ida could cost insurers at least $15 billion. That's according to one of the earliest estimates of analysts as they start assessing the damage from one of the most powerful storms to strike Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. Wells Fargo analysts say the final tab could be as high as $20 billion, but another analyst called $20 billion, quote, a good starting point. The number of Americans dying from COVID-19 is on the rise, the highest since March. The nation recorded more than 24,000 deaths this month as of Sunday. That's according to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University and Bloomberg. Confirmed cases of 3.8 million are the highest since January. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Anne-Marie?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, we'll talk with retired Major General Arnold Punaro as the U.S. military makes its final plans to exit Afghanistan. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew, along with Anne-Marie Hordern in Washington. Joining us now is retired U.S. Marine Corps General Arnold Punaro as we look at the military options. One day before the deadline for U.S. troops to leave Afghanistan, General Punaro, a former staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee and has a long resume in the armed forces, chairman of the National Defense Industrial Association, author as well of the new book, The Ever-Shrinking Light Force. General, it's great to have you here. You carried a rifle in Vietnam and continued to fight in combat, in deployment in Iraq. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of the military hardware that we are leaving behind. It seems to be one of the lesser reported stories here. Hundreds of trucks, night vision goggles, tanks, aircraft that the Taliban apparently does not know how to fly but could sell. What kind of a risk are we creating by leaving all that on the ground?
Well, it's unfortunate that the way what I call a retreat, not a retrograde, is occurring, we didn't have the opportunity to get all this equipment out. I mean, this is one of the problems with the whole way the thing is being done. So not only, sadly, are we not going to get all the Americans and all the Afghans that supported us out, we're also leaving behind a lot of very expensive, very capable equipment. I personally don't have an inventory. Some of it we shouldn't worry that much about. Trucks and things like that, but there is some sophisticated equipment that could get into the wrong hands. We also know that we're going to leave a opening for terrorist organizations to move back into Afghanistan, and this is equipment that they could get and use, not just in the United States, but also some of their close by neighbors.
Well, I'd like to ask you about that. The idea, General, some of this equipment could be used against us. We've been hearing a lot about over-the-horizon missions and over-the-horizon posture in which we would be working against terrorism from outside of the country, right, from drones or aircraft and elsewhere. Is that a reasonable mission for us to get our heads around here? Will that be effective after the U.S. military leaves Kabul?
So there are two things, Joe. One, I don't think any of the equipment we're leaving behind will give terrorist organizations to target us from Afghanistan. So whatever over-the-horizon capability or limited range some of that equipment has, it's going to be more vis-a-vis Pakistan or China or India, some of their neighbors. Now, in terms of the U.S. being able to basically do over-the-horizon capabilities, if we were to see Al-Qaeda or ISIS-K really begin, or other terrorist organizations really begin to build up in Afghanistan or in the federal administered tribal areas of Pakistan, we have some over-the-horizon capabilities that could be used, like the drone strike we did the other day. But as former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said, if we see those buildups occurring, we're probably going to have to go back in there. And as someone that has been in combat a number of times, frankly, in situations like this, while the high technology is important, you find out to really eradicate it, you have to have boots on the ground. So it will be a combination of over the horizon, but if the threat is that large, we are going to end up having to send people back in to take them out.
General, how reliable is Pakistani intelligence for the United States, especially given the fraught relationship? Since the president has been inaugurated, he's yet even to call Imran Khan. How do you see that relationship playing out now?
Well, you know, Anne-Marie, that's a terrific question. And let me give you a little bit of history, because as the staff director of the Armed Services Committee with then Chairman Senator Sam Nunn, President Bush asked us to go to Pakistan and meet with the head of Pakistan, Zia-ul-Haq, to talk about whether or not we should give the Mujahideen, who were fighting to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan, Stingers, which were very capable against the Soviet helicopters, which was the way they moved in Afghanistan. And the decision was made, and Pakistan was supporting us at that time. The Mujahideen were actually the Taliban. So the Taliban was allied with the U.S. then in pushing the Soviets out, and the Stingers worked well. That relationship has deteriorated over the years, and Pakistan has protected the terrorists. They've supported the Taliban. And while Pakistan is important, they're not sharing any useful intelligence with us about terrorist organizations, because they're supporting them and they're protecting them in the federal administered tribal areas. So I don't think we can trust Pakistan at all.
It's 9:16 p.m. Kabul time, General. What does, given your experience in the military, in Vietnam, in Iraq, what does the final hours of a withdrawal look like? How many troops do you assess have probably left? What exactly is happening at that airport as the U.S. says goodbye?
Well, I would say even though the forward planning left a lot to be desired, I think the backward planning, our military is on top of that. They know who's going to be manifested on every single flight till the last flight goes out. My instinct tells me the senior officials and whatever senior diplomats are going to go out will go out on the last flight. Obviously, I don't have the numbers, and they're not sharing those numbers, and they're not sharing the time frame. But I'm very confident our military has the final day mapped out very carefully. But again, I think we have to understand we're not getting all the Americans out. We're not getting all the Afghans that supported us out. I personally think the first thing President Biden ought to do right now is send a finding up to the intelligence committees, establishing a covert program run by the CIA, supported by our special operators under Title 50, so we can continue to get Americans and Afghans out, whether the Taliban cooperate or not. I mean, we were depending at the airport on our sworn enemy, the Taliban. And no matter what anybody says on the shows, the administration spokesman, as soon as they take over, they're going to take that country back to the Stone Age. So we're in a very, very bad situation. And they certainly, I don't think, are going to cooperate once we're gone. So we're going to need a covert program to get our people out.
General, what does that mean also for the former Afghan National Army members, if that's what I'm supposed to call them, who are left in Panjshir province? I've heard that there are thousands, as many as 10,000 of them still there, anti-Taliban, a stronghold that is, in fact, continuing the mission that we had trained them to do. I know that that's a tough area for the Taliban in general, but should we be helping them? Should there be CIA operatives helping what's left of the Afghan National Army that was fighting on behalf of the U.S.?
I certainly would think we should help anybody that's willing to take on the Taliban and anybody that's willing to take on the terrorist organizations that are going to grow back. One of the big mistakes we made, which was the same mistake we made in Vietnam, instead of Vietnamizing the war and we Americanize it, we taught the South Vietnamese with our equipment and how to fight like us. We did the same thing in Afghanistan. Once we left Vietnam in '73, their army collapsed. Now that we're leaving Afghanistan, because we gave them our equipment that they can't operate without us, we trained them to fight like us. The Taliban fights guerrilla war. They don't fight conventional war. So I think, yes, we should help anybody that's left that's willing to risk their lives to take on this terrorist organization that's going to basically, again, take that country back to the Stone Age.
General, thank you. Thanks to retired General Arnold Punaro with us today on Balance of Power. Coming up, Hurricane Ida leaves a path of destruction in Louisiana. We'll look into its impact on the energy markets coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Good afternoon. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern alongside Joe Matthew. Now to the latest on Hurricane Ida. President Biden will meet virtually next hour with the head of FEMA and the governors of Louisiana and other affected states. 1 million homes and businesses are without power right now after the storm made landfall yesterday. Storm also caused disruption to Gulf Coast oil and gas operations, but the full extent of the damage is still unknown. Bloomberg's David Wethy joins us for the latest. David, what can you tell us about the Gulf Coast, their operations there, on top of also the refineries that are now coming offline because of this?
Yeah, you make a key distinction there in kind of breaking those two out, because it does seem as though the producers, the production part of all this may fare a little bit better than what the refineries may see out of all this. Goldman Sachs said in the note today that they expect more rapid return of oil production than refining production in the region. And so, you've got a situation where the offshore production platforms were able to sort of batten down the hatches and stay protected, and may not have taken as much of a blow and may be able to get back and running faster than the land-based operations of the refiners. So we'll have to wait and see about that. The refiners add up to 12% of America's total oil refining capacity. So a significant chunk that we'll wait to see when they can come back on.
David, a lot was said in advance of this storm about the millions in infrastructure improvements that were made following Katrina, to pumps, to dams, to levees. I wonder how that is all holding up here, if it's too early to say, and what that might mean for our infrastructure debate here in Washington. Is there more money coming to the Gulf Coast that would help prevent flooding and some of the impacts that we're seeing from this storm?
Certainly, to the last point, I can definitely tell you that from where I sit in Houston, that there's hope for more money to come to help for flooding stoppage, and especially if it could come from Washington. That has not happened yet as much, and there's still talk about how they can build that up. But to your first point, so far everything seems to be holding relatively well within the city of New Orleans itself, thanks to the billions in levee improvements. Our reporter Sergio Chapa in New Orleans. So far, everything seems fine, according to him, at least on the streets, as far as no flooding is concerned. But like you say, it is a little too early still.
What's the outlook for gasoline prices, David? Here in Washington, this administration has another letter from the FTC cracking down on mergers and acquisitions for oil and gas companies. A third letter. I read this as potentially they're worried about consumers at the pump.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a concern right now, and especially with the storm not helping things. You did see gasoline futures jump as much as 4% today. They've pared back a little bit now, about up to 1.7%. So there is concern that right now the gasoline may be a little bit more of a shortage.
Many thanks to Bloomberg's David Wethy with us. I'm Joe Matthew with Anne-Marie Hordern, and Balance of Power continues next on Bloomberg Radio, our second hour, as we turn back to the evacuation from Kabul. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.